The movie clip from It's a Wonderful Life that you saw today begs this question. How can you be the kind of person who doesn't care? Mr. Potter, if you remember in the movie, is this miser type person. He takes from everybody he can. And then the depression happens and he keeps taking. And George Bailey's father, Peter, doesn't want to foreclose on the mortgages for people that have received their loans for their homes from him. And he's having this argument with Mr. Potter. And then his son George has basically the same argument with Potter. Essentially this question: how can you be the kind of person who doesn't care? Now, I don't know if you've ever been asked that question. It's kind of a nasty question, right? You really don't want to be seen, at least I don't think so, as someone who doesn't care. That's kind of nasty. But I know people who have heard those words, sometimes from family members. You know how it is in families? Somebody has, say, money, and somebody doesn't, and this person wants from this person. And the words out of the one that doesn't have to the one that does. How can you not care about me? And this happens in many different kinds of settings, but I think it is so hurtful when it comes from family. It also brings us to ask this question of ourselves. How do we care about our generosity? How do we care about how we share the gifts that God has given us? What is that relationship we keep going back to, spirituality and money? We want to separate out often our life, our religious life, stand here. This is where I pray, this is where I worship. This is completely separate from the rest of life. Where I work, where I spend time with my family, how I go on vacation, and how I spend my money. And the reality is that as a person of faith, we cannot separate our faith from our life, which means our life includes dealing with issues of money. We can't just separate that piece out. It's a part of how we are children of God. Jesus goes over this over and over and over again in his own teachings. Our relationship with money is important. So we come to this time of year in the church and we look forward to 2020. And so this passage to Timothy has some words of advice for us. Don't become egotistical, and people should not place hope in their finances. I think the last 20 years or so, we've probably all learned that to some extent, right? With the volatile markets, with companies that have behaved badly, all of those stories. We have felt in jeopardy, we've been in jeopardy, and yet, hear these words, not to place hope in finances, because they are uncertain. The word comes, they need to hope in God, who richly provides everything for our enjoyment. To be rich in good things, the good things they do, to be generous and to share with others. And we see this lived out in It's a Wonderful Life in this movie, where George Bailey gives and works with the people who come to the savings and loan, and he helps them with the things that are really, really important, right? He is very, very generous with what he does as far as running his business and sharing what he has with the rest of the town. And so he answers this question with the way that he lives, the question that Dior read earlier. Do we reap love and generosity or bitterness and resentment? George in his practice reaped love and generosity. We kind of see him questioning that when he wonders what he's going to do with this $8,000 that's missing, if you remember the movie. But we really see him offering love and generosity in everything that he does. And so we're invited to, in our relationship with God, in our relationship with spirituality and money, to take a look at the bigger picture, to look out beyond ourselves. Last week we were looking in, to look out. What are we looking out for? What are we looking for even here at the church? What are we looking for in the way of worship and classes and mission and ministry? What is it we're looking for? How is God moving us to a new place, to a new thing? And it's important for us to align ourselves not only with our own vision of what we want to do with the riches that we've been blessed with, but also fitting in with the vision that God has for this place. How do we balance our well-being with this bigger picture of the church? Because as we talked about last week and the week before, the big picture is everything is God's anyway, right? And yet we want to kind of once in a while be like Mr. Potter and keep everything to ourselves. And yet Scripture's pretty clear. We're not to do that. We are meant to be a generous people. And it's not that we're meant to be generous just with money. We're meant to be generous with our time as well. That's part of bringing balance. One of the things that we recognize in all of this is that we are connected to one another. We discover that in the movie as we come to the end, and everybody comes to George's house and gives him enough money so he can pay this debt. But it takes everybody. Just like it takes all of you for us to live out God's vision for us. Here, coming into the end of 2019, and certainly in preparing for 2020. It takes an interconnectedness. Not just this person separate from this person, separate from this person, but everybody participating in their own way of being generous, their own way of sharing their life in relationship with God, with others. And so we look at what does it mean to live a life that is generous. Here I am losing my... Am I still on the mic? No. Okay. Mike, could you move the camera? Okay. Gremlins. Again. So we look in this connectedness with all, and we ask and look for hope in the church. So if you go back into the word, into the Latin of prosperity, we find several different ways that it's used, but one of the ways it's used is to offer hope. It is for hope. So if we think of prosperity being for hope, what do you hope for this congregation? What do you hope for in your life and faith? What do you hope will happen as we end this year and begin next year? Because the answer of that hope is related to you and how you share your generosity with the church. It's all connected together. How we share, how we live out this life of being a spiritual being in a human body, blessed by God with such abundance. And for all of us, that abundance is going to be different. It might be time, it might be energy, it might be creativity, it might be money. And all of those things help us balance out the whole. The other thing that we look at is how then do we as a church respond? And one of the things that's important and of value to us actually comes from liberation theology. where we look at what is understanding to be God's preferential treatment for the poor. All of the ministry that Jesus did were to those who did not have, right? They weren't for the people up on the hill or in the big houses. Not that that's invalid, but his ministry was to the poor. And so we look at our own relationship with how we spend money in the church in that way, through that lens. And one of the ways that we do that is through civic participation. It's important for us to be involved in the community, right? And many of you here did this yesterday. You lived this generosity in your own lives as you were downtown at the Pride Festival Friday night and Saturday. You lived that generosity. So you see how the pieces then fall together. One of the reasons that we were able to do Pride is because of your generosity money-wise this year, because it's an expensive proposition for anybody to rent a booth down there. But we did that because people gave. And then there was more generosity because you spent your time. You see how this works. And this is all in living out that piece of God's preferential treatment for those who do not have, for those who are suffering in some way in the world. So this notion of generosity and hospitality can be seen in many, many practices. One of the practices we're seeing come alive right before us of hospitality is in serving the students from UNLV. Pastor Samara shared with you 75 students last week. That's incredible. Pretty soon we're going to have to move that meal in here because there won't be enough room in there to set up enough tables. I'm going to pass out that day. But you see how the connectedness, the energy moves in a way that just builds and builds and builds. Generosity and hospitality, like a fire coming. Talk about spark. Offering ourselves in ways that a couple of years ago we never ever thought of. And yet here we are, following God's vision for this place. Just waiting to see what else will be unfolded. How we respond to moving forward is a part of that. How you respond to the letters that most of you should have received this week with your pledge card for your commitment for 2020 will impact what we can do. It's part of that interconnectedness. We are all part of what makes anything happen at this church. And I know that it's not always fun to think about, oh, the check I write this week is going to help pay the church's electric bill. That doesn't sound real fun. But it has to happen, right? We have to pay insurance and electricity and heat and cooling and staff salaries. Otherwise, all of the rest of the stuff doesn't have a chance of happening. It's all connected, and it's all related to each one of you and your generous hearts, each one of you combining your life of faith and the rest of your life into one, so that you're able to share generously with all that you do. Another question that we ask, another question we ask is, okay, I'm going to move again. Another question that we ask besides, what do we hope for here in the congregation? What do we hope for here in the church? Besides a sound system that works, is to also ask ourselves, are strings attached to what we give? When we give something, are we insistent that it only be spent in this way? And for some things, that's appropriate. But if everything goes into a special category, we still don't get to pay the bills. We still don't get to pay the insurance and pay the salaries. And we certainly do that specialized giving with memorials and a few other things. But we still have to understand the interconnectedness of all of us. So as we look out and see the vision, it's for us to see how we live into this belonging together. As a church, we need to expand our vision. We need to expand what we do in order to move into the future. And we need to reach new people. And that will only happen by your participation in this campaign, in your commitment to 2020. As I said before, there's only so much we can do, and without you, then there are many things that we can't. And so we look forward to building a future and reaching new people. But it is all about you. So how will you move into, in your own relationship with God, a vision for 2020, and in your relationship with the church and your giving? As I said, we can't have this one part of our life separate, our religious life, separate from the rest of our life, including our money life. That, like it or not, they're interwoven, and when we recognize that, we can live and respond generously from a new place. There's a quote that says something to the effect that all is hidden in plain sight. It's very much like the scripture that tells us that we should not hide a light under a bushel basket. That your light, your spark of Jesus needs to shine away from the basket. That all is hidden in plain sight is all of you, and you're all here. And that's what's real. And that's what will make a real difference for the transformation of this community. It really does. We are not meant to be a hidden people. Jesus brings the light of the world to the world. We're the vehicle of how the rest of the world gets to see it, right? The rest of the world sees it through us. And so it's so vital, our participation. So vital to know that we're not being asked as a church the question, how can we be a church that doesn't care? We're not there. This is a safe place and a generous place and a wonderful place. And we share the love of God in the ways that we can. So that's your invitation for this season of stewardship. That you are all in plain sight. And you are all part of the generosity of the whole that's interconnected. This whole notion that it says in this text about being rich in the things that we do, being generous and sharing with others. We print that out on cards and give them to everybody. It's important for us to hear, because this is how this verse ends. That way, they can take hold of what is truly life. And that's that bringing connection, a whole life together. For us to be whole and have true life, generosity is a part of that. Participating in generosity is a part of that. Sarah Bernhardt, and I'll close with this, writes this: life engenders life. Energy creates energy. It is by spending oneself we become rich. May that be true for you as you think about filling out these cards and returning them next week. Amen.